Well, this is part 2 of our series, Secrets and Spies of the Revolutionary War, with the emphasis on George Washington, the father of our country. And in this episode, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library, and together we'll peel back the layers of myth and the legend to reveal the complex, strategic, and often secretive life of America's first president, George Washington. We'll explore how George Washington, not just as a general and a statesman, but how he dealt with espionage, deception, and psychological warfare. And what were the secrets behind his success? How did his spy network help him win the war? And what can we learn about the man behind the legend? Well, I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told, and please help me welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Well, thank you so much for being here. And I want to make sure in my intro that I said your name right, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky.
Yes.
Yay, I got it right. The blonde did not seep too far in. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm a big history buff. I've always loved American history, even world history, but American history, of course, because my family goes way back, clear up into the early 16, sometimes late 1500s. My seventh great-grandfather was Richard Stockton, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And they all, in the Stockton family, I always called them before the Kennedys, because almost every one of them were like senators and congressmen and judges and, signers and all kinds of different things. But I've always found it very fascinating, the secrets, the spies, the espionage, and some of the secret societies that some of these leaders were a part of. And so I thought, when I read your bio and saw your books, I'm like, oh, I have to have her on. And hopefully we can answer some stuff today. Some stuff might go unanswered because we just don't know. So let's start there. So I want to find out, as the director, executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library, how did you approach this, and you see your mission in preserving and in interpreting Washington's legacy for the modern audience? Because it's been quite a few years since he's been president. How do you preserve and interpret his legacy?
Such a great question. Well, I think there are a couple of things. So Mount Vernon, more broadly, certainly preserves the site of Mount Vernon. And that tells us actually a lot about the evolution of American history, because Washington was incredibly innovative with things like crop rotation and using the newest scientific advancements to try and improve his agricultural output. And when he adopted something, then other people tended to as well. So he was one of the first farmers in the area to adopt wheat instead of tobacco. He was actually the creator of the American mule, which was an essential part of settlement across the West and the United States more broadly. It, was a critical part of average farms being able to function, because horses were not as efficient and were not as easy to maintain as mules. So there are things like that we can really connect Washington's story, in particular at Mount Vernon, to the sort of broad American story. But then at the Presidential Library, we really focus on a lot of the precedents that Washington established, first as commander-in-chief and then as president, because so much of our political system today, and I would say even our political culture, our civic culture, rests on norm and custom. Actually, very little of it is written down. And so much of that norm and custom comes from Washington. And so when we think about Washington's legacy, we're not just talking about the things he did, we're talking about how did other presidents pick those up and use them in their administrations? How did they discuss Washington? How did they think about their role vis-a-vis Washington? And that brings us all the way up to today. So this legacy is one that is not kept in the 18th century, which can sometimes feel quite foreign and distant to us, but rather explains a lot about our current moment.
And what is some of the primary sources or archival materials that you use at the library that really most illuminate the hidden or less known aspects of, Washington's leadership during this time and the Revolutionary War?
Well, we are on one hand blessed that we continue to acquire documents and artifacts all of the time, including a really cool letter that I will give as an example for what you're talking about.
Yes, please.
But unfortunately, because Washington, when he died, he left the bulk of his papers and his books to his not his direct heirs, but his family members. And over generations, they actually sold off much of that material. So the bulk of it, or I should say, the largest majority of originals is at the Library of Congress, and then a lot of it is scattered around the world. But that gives us an opportunity to try and acquire the things that are not in places like the Library of Congress, who are very comfortable holding that. However, there is a lot of opportunity, especially when you actually look at the document, to get a better understanding of what Washington was intending. So one of Washington's greatest contributions was ensuring the civilian control of the military. And this is a foundational element of our republic. We are run by a civilian government, and it oversees the military, and the military is kept separate from civilian life. The military does not engage in domestic peacekeeping. That is very much a Washington, or at least partially a Washington creation. Others obviously were committed to that too. And one of the moments in which he ensures that happens is what's called the Newburgh Conspiracy, when a number of officers towards the end of the war were worried that Congress was going to basically send them home without paying them the years of back pay they were owed. And they started talking about ways that they might be able to use military force to force them to pay that back pay, which is essentially a military coup.
Right.
Washington got wind of this. He called a meeting, and he went in and he started to read an address in a way that was quite theatrical, in a way that sometimes leaders need to be. So he pulls out this address. He then pulls out his spectacles, which were not something you typically wore in polite company. And he said, I apologize. I have gone blind and gray in service to my nation. And the men in the room burst into tears, and it totally diffused the situation. But 2 weeks later, he wrote a letter to a congressman that he was quite close to. And this is the letter that we recently acquired. It's an 11-page letter. It's in his hand, which is quite revealing, because typically he had so much correspondence to do that when he had a letter that length, he would have a secretary write it out. But it's in his hand, and he's talking about his concern about safely decommissioning the army, but also ensuring that they're cared for and they're paid. So it's directly speaking to this threat of the Newburgh Conspiracy. And he underlined certain passages, so you can see the emotion in this letter and his commitment to it in a way that if you're just reading the text, it's not always clear.
I have to say that's pretty amazing, but that's actually a T-shirt that needs to be sold at the gift shop, blind and gray. I love that. There's so much that we don't know about Washington, just as you said, because there's still a lot of documentation that has been dispersed. Where do you get a lot of this new discoveries? Is it directly from the people that have just, went through paperwork and go, oh, what is this? And they, bring it to you as, to purchase, or do people come and just say, I want to donate it to the library? Because I think that's important. For me, I think I would want to donate it just because it was part of American history. But you're laughing, so I'm assuming that's not everybody.
Well, no, I'm laughing because we love that. If people have Washington letters and they want to give them to us, by all means. Right. The challenge is that they are also quite valuable. So often people don't want to do that. Although it is a donation and a tax write-off. So if you're thinking about that, that is an option. So most of the letters we know about because there's the Washington Papers Project, which is a multi-decade project in partnership with Mount Vernon and the University of Virginia Press, which is putting together an edited collection of the Washington volumes. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these volumes. There are different series. So the Colonial series, the Revolutionary series, the Presidential series, etc. And so they went on, the way they start that project is they go around the world to archives and they take scans of whatever that archive has to use for this transcription project. So most of the letters that are in at least somewhat public institutions we know about. And sometimes those will come up for auction. But occasionally letters are found. For example, a letter was recently found at Gunston Hall, which was George Mason's home, that no one knew about. It was a unpublished, non-known letter, which is an amazing find. The way we acquire letters is threefold. One, sometimes there are donations. Two, sometimes things go up for auction and then we do bid on them depending on what the letter is and its value. And then three, sometimes in the case of this letter, a family owned it, a woman owned it, and she had purchased it. It had been in the family since, I believe, the 1930s.
Wow.
And the owner passed away and her estate was ready to sell it. And so they got an estimate and they said, we would love to sell this to Mount Vernon. We would love to avoid auction. Can we, sell it to you directly and save money by not doing the bidding and not doing the, auction house fees? So we do also do private sales in that particular way. And so we always welcome people with outreach. If they have something that they believe is Washington's, we're happy to talk about it and see what we can arrange.
And I always encourage people. I do this myself. My grandparents, my parents. Now that my father's 90, I just recently sold the family home. But I go through all the paperwork. I don't just throw paperwork away because you never know what is in there. In fact, my dad had his great grandmother gave my dad. It's a picture. I don't know if it's a postcard. I don't even know, but it's Abraham Lincoln, and it's from the late 1800s. So
that's very cool.
Yeah, and so if I would have just picked it up and thrown trash away, I would have thrown it away. But I'm just one of those people. I look through everything. So I encourage people not to just throw things away, but to look through in case there is something of historical value, if it's family, personal business, or something of history. So please do that. So I want to dive into the Revolutionary War era espionage, because Washington has often been described as America's first spy master. And so I want to ask you, what do you think people misunderstand most about the approach of espionage and this title of spy master?
Well, I do love the title, and I actually agree with the title because he was very much his own spy master for the Continental Army. Partly that was because he understood the more people that you have in on a spy ring, the more likely it is to be broken up. He was a little bit of a control freak, so he really liked to control important things, and he also wanted to be aware of all of the information. So this was not something he was going to really leave in other people's hands. And he was instrumental in getting this spy ring set up. So first spy master title I approve of. I think there are a couple of elements that I would add to perhaps the first mythical story. The first is anytime you have a war dynamic like the one that is the Revolution, spying, especially local spying in the local communities, are essential because the British Army was essentially an invading force trying to establish control over a massive piece of territory and a huge number of people. And we know from, wars that have occurred since then, you need a huge amount of firepower, you need very strong supply lines, but also you need local spies in order to make that work. And Washington understood that, and he was keen to flip the spy dynamic on its head and use spies to weaken what was Great Britain's, military strength, naval strength. They were on paper a much stronger opponent. And so his local connections were a strength that he could use to undermine the British position. And he did quite effectively. Washington Times referred to this as having to win the hearts and minds of the American people. So if you have them on your side, they're more likely to give you information. And he was happy to get information wherever he got it, including, for example, after the famous crossing the Delaware and the successful battle at Trenton, he called what was called a council of war with his officers and his aides. And they brought in a couple of local farmers to talk to him about the terrain because he was kind of stuck in this position and was going to be attacked by Cornwallis. And the farmers knew about a secret path that would go around the British forces that weren't on any maps. And so by getting that local intel, he was able to basically sneak by the British forces and march on to Princeton, where they had an incredible victory. So that local intel, whether it's secret or not, is essential. The other piece that I would add is when we think of 21st century spycraft and the technology and the complex codes. That was not what was happening in the 18th century. They were using sort of experimenting with different kinds of ink. They were experimenting. The most famous was shown in the show Turn, where Anna Strong, who was probably one of the Culper Ring connections, would hang laundry in a certain way to kind of symbolize movement. And they did have sort of simple or relatively simple codes that they would use, but spies today could break those codes like that. So we are not talking about the very complex methodology that we have today.
We didn't have the Secret Service at that time. And as we use term now as open door policy, what was his open door policy? You said he took the information from as much as he could. How did he know? I mean, we weren't there, but how do we know who he could trust and who he could not?
This is a great question. So as president, Washington had no guards, no security. There was no gate outside the president's house.
Right.
Anyone could walk up to the street. As commander-in-chief, initially he didn't have a whole lot of security. I mean, he was surrounded by an army, but he didn't have anyone that was necessarily focused on his personal security. And then they uncovered that there was actually a plot to assassinate him.
Oh, wow.
And they created what was called the Life Guard. And the Life Guard was a group of guards that were dedicated to preserving the baggage, or, taking care of the baggage and headquarters and Washington security, recognizing that those were sort of points of weakness around his personal safety. And they were officers that he personally selected for their trustworthiness, and they were deeply, deeply loyal to him. And in honor of that, we actually have a group of donors who are called the Life Guard at Mount Vernon now, which I think is a lovely tie-in. So in terms of who he could trust, Washington very much believed in trust but verify. So he would get information from, let's say, the farmers in this circumstance, but then he would send some of his aides or his officers to go investigate the path before they actually used it.
Right.
So he was very careful to always, double check the sources of things. He was very careful to double check the validity of that information. Now, that's not to say that he always got this right. He didn't. A lot of his campaigns in 1776 were undermined by the lack of that information, by not getting enough information. But when he did get it, usually he got it right.
I love that. Because I always thought it's like to have, the protection that they do now, and, to even up to Kennedy when, he was unfortunately assassinated. I couldn't even imagine to live in that era of really not a lot of protection. So I'm glad he had some support, though.
He did.
Could you talk a little more about or a little bit about the Culper Ring and how it worked and what made it so effective? Even despite this little limited technology as we do today.
So the Culper Ring was largely focused around the New York area, and this was where the British forces had a stronghold for most of the war. Once they kicked the American forces out of New York City in 1776, they held on to the city until the very end of the war, when they vacated in 1783. And so at various points when Washington was considering either his next movement, when he was considering a battle, when he was considering an attack, when he was considering where to put his winter quarters, he needed information on what the British were up to and where they were going to go next. And he was incredibly wise about the people that he selected as potential spies. They were people that had a lot of access to British officers, but wouldn't necessarily be suspicious because they were sort of invisible or, social nobodies. So the most famous is Hercules Mulligan, who was a tailor, and he would tailor adjust the uniforms. That's what I was looking for. Uniforms of the British forces. And while he was doing these sessions, they would be talking about what they were going to do next and not paying attention to him. And he was then able to often put messages into clothing, like sew them into the seams and get them out of the city in that way. The Culper Ring also then included a number of people on the other side of the harbor and the other side of the river, because you have to get the information out of the city to Washington. And this is where Anna Strong was useful, because she could send messages without actually having to go anywhere or carry material, which is when you are at your most vulnerable for a spy. The challenge with the Culper Ring is there's actually relatively little documentation about who was in it, what they were doing, who was responsible for what, who was in charge of it, because Washington intentionally left little written record. He understood that that would be a vulnerability, and that would make it more likely that this Culper Ring would be broken up or would be infiltrated. And so we just don't have that much information, although I know we wish that we had more because it's such a fascinating story.
I wish that they would have thought about the time capsules of hide it, but yet leave somewhere so we can keep a little bit more track of our history. I'm going to jump into secret societies when it comes to Freemason, because I know there were several of the founding fathers. In fact, my seventh great grandfather was a Freemason, and it often comes up in discussion about the founding fathers. What was Washington's actual involvement, and how much influence did the Freemasons really have? I mean, apparently a lot, because it pretty much shaped Washington, D.C. So, but at that period when George Washington was around, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the influence of the Freemasons in terms of shaping society is perhaps a little bit overstated, because it makes for a really good story.
It does.
The movies like National Treasure, which of course everyone loves, and so it does make for a great film. But it was a critical element of civic society at the time, and religion played an important part of that. But at the era that Washington was living in, this was sort of the Age of Enlightenment, when most of the leaders in society were incredibly well educated. They were reading, all of the Enlightenment thinkers from Europe. They were importing books and discussing these things both publicly and then in private. And so the Freemasons, I think, served as an important part of the civic fabric, because they gave a space for people to think a little bit outside the box of traditional religion or even traditional political culture, and also tended to be it has its own hierarchy, but it tends to be a fairly egalitarian gathering. And as they were discussing creating a new nation, which inherently requires a new culture and a new political system, that was a space to put forward some of these ideas. So Washington was a member of a lodge. There continue to be many lodges named after him, and they regularly actually come to Mount Vernon and pay respects. There's a day usually that they come and they lay a wreath at his tomb. But I think that certainly there are elements of Masonic thinking that were quite important to the creation of Washington, D.C., and how it was laid out, and some of the elements in the architecture and the design that they were trying to incorporate. But these were also ideas that had been circulating in sort of city planning and what an ideal city would look like, as well as a very intentional nod to Roman and Greek history, of trying to bring forth the most important values of what it means to be a republic, to have virtuous citizenry. And a lot of the buildings and the design of the city were meant to invoke those principles.
Yeah, like I said, I've had the opportunity to join the Freemasons. I didn't as of yet, but I've always found them fascinating, because I've heard, a lot of the answers that we do seek. They do have some information, but the TV shows do enhance a lot of what movies and TV shows that to make us, I think, intrigue us even more. But do you think these type of societies and networks that contributed to a broader cultural of conspiracy thinking among revolutionaries and their opponents, or?
Well, Americans to a certain extent have always been fans of conspiracies. And I think that is to a certain extent, when you have a democratic society that is calling for transparency in a lot of its decision-making process, when there isn't transparency, then that can lead to conspiratorial thinking. And when you have a society that does value freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, although that has, of course, shifted over time, sometimes you are going to have space for that type of thinking, and it can proliferate. During the revolution, there was a sense that there wasn't necessarily a conspiracy, but they blamed the British cabinet, which met in secret. There were no notes. There was no record of who said what. They blamed the British cabinet for controlling the king and turning the king against the American people. And they believed that this was really the center for cronyism and corruption at the highest levels. Now, I don't think that many would go so far as to say that there was, a conspiracy to destroy the colonies or to crush them. But that's often how it felt to them because they couldn't penetrate what was happening behind those closed doors. And so much of the design of the first federal system in the Constitution passed in 1789 is crafted with that sort of transparency in mind. So they actually rejected proposals for a cabinet for the president. They rejected proposals for various executive councils. They put that the executive department secretaries should be giving their advice in writing. So there was a record of who said what and who did what. And initially, the Senate proceedings were not open to the press, and there was a lot of pushback to that, and that shifted in the first decade or 2 decades of American history. So we can see a lot of the concerns about secrecy playing out in the early republic.
Yeah, and you mentioned Britain, but what role did other European powers such as France and Spain and even secret missionaries play behind the scenes in supporting the Revolutionary War?
Well, there was a lot of initial clandestine support. So some of it came through very wealthy individuals that were, sending shipments of arms and goods and money and food to the American cause. The Marquis de Lafayette, of course, is the most famous, kind of, renting a ship and going off himself to join the American army. There were a lot of European soldiers who came over to fight, sometimes for altruistic purposes and genuinely believing in the cause, and sometimes because they didn't have a whole lot of promotion in their army and they thought that they could get a generalship pretty easily in the new Continental Army. But, what's interesting is that France was pretty supportive of the United States starting almost immediately in the war, but didn't actually declare alliance with the United States and didn't actually recognize independence until 1778, which was 2 years, of course, after the Declaration. So all of the sport that was taking place up until that point was in theory clandestine. Now, of course, the British understood all of a sudden when you have arms, when you have muskets coming and guns coming onto the field of battle that are from France, it doesn't take a genius to put those two pieces together. So they understood where the support was coming from, but in theory, they could maintain plausible deniability for diplomacy. Spain actually never declared itself openly allied with the United States during the war. That came later, but they did provide support, especially sort of through France, and so a lot of that support came secretly. And the Netherlands were a very important economic partner, but that partnership as well didn't come until towards the end of the war, so a lot of the support early on was secret.
I don't know if you saw the, I think it was Apple TV, and I think it was Franklin. It was the name of it. Mm-hmm. Did you see that?
I saw some of it. I didn't watch the entire series, but I did watch some of it, yeah.
I mean, I actually loved it, but it gave a whole different side that we don't normally get to see. And again, Hollywood adds its flair, but I found it very fascinating to
My
watch
main
it.
complaint with it was just the depiction of John Adams is utterly ridiculous. And
Sure.
What's interesting though is I was listening to an interview with the screenplay writer, and he actually also wrote the screenplay for John Adams, the HBO miniseries. And so what he said is that series is through John Adams' eyes, and this one is through Franklin's eyes. But I actually think that depiction of Franklin is a little bit fairer in the HBO series than this one of John Adams, who just makes him out to be this preposterous figure. And there were certainly things that John Adams did wrong, but not in that degree. But I think you're right that it does get at the point where, France and its support was essential for the United States to have success. And we as Americans now tend not to think in a global fashion because we're such a powerful nation, we don't have to. But in the revolution, and even, for the first half of the 19th century, the United States was a baby nation that had relatively little power. And so the American people actually cared deeply and paid very close attention to what happened beyond our shores, because it would have such a huge impact on our nation, our economy, our ability to function. And so Americans at the time did care deeply about what was happening in France.
And Louisiana Purchase. But I've heard many times, America saved France. Well, yeah, we helped save France, but they helped save us to even get started. So that's what we're supposed to be, help each other out. But I do want to talk about, you mentioned
There's actually a great story about that. When General
me.
Pershing arrived in Paris towards the end of World War I, he went to the tomb of Lafayette and he said, "We have arrived." So he was basically intentionally repaying that promise.
See, there we go. I love it. And you mentioned John Adams, and I do want to talk about just real quick about your book, Making the Presidency, and what surprised you most about Adams' influence on the office.
Well, my first book was on Washington and the creation of the president's cabinet, but it really focuses how he basically creates the presidency, because Article 2 is so incredibly short and says so little about what the day-to-day life or even the use of the power would look like. But then I started to think about, what happens when Washington left office, because he was such an unusual figure in our story. He was so unparalleled in his stature and the respect that even people who disagreed with him had for who he was and his service. So much of his power and so much of his precedents were unchallenged or with very little pushback. That was not going to be the case for any of his successors. And so John Adams had the very unenviable but essential task of following that. And what that would look like was going to be incredibly difficult. And he knew it, and he did it anyway, recognizing that in order for the presidency and the republic to survive, someone had to be number two and had to ensure that those precedents that Washington established continued in order to actually be precedents. Because if they're not repeated, then they're just interesting historical anomalies. And so I think I was impressed by his awareness of what he was doing, of the point of his administration, and his commitment to ensuring that both his transition into office and then his transition out were done peacefully and in a way that would lay the foundation for what it means to be a republic, which is that you do have a peaceful transfer of power.
Couldn't you imagine? I just think about if Whitney Houston was still alive and you or me had to go on stage and sing after her.
Exactly.
I couldn't imagine, being, Washington being so loved, people wanted him to continue as president, or I don't even remember. I think maybe even a king type of figure.
Yeah.
And then him saying no, and then having somebody come in after him. But that leads me actually to, before we get out of here, because I don't want to keep you too much. But what he had so much power. He could have stayed and had become almost king-like. I mean, we're seeing it, from a lot of his successors wanted power. They just wanted power. And he walked away from that. What contributed to that, where he did not want to continue that power?
Well, I think, so he walked away from it twice, which was,
right.
We can't, today we expect presidents to do that. That is how our political system works.
Right.
And we live in a world in which there are regular elections and there is a peaceful transfer of power sort of around the globe. Not everywhere around the globe, but they exist around the globe. When Washington did it, it wasn't done. This was the age of kings and military dictators. And, not that many years later, Napoleon comes onto the scene and will fight back from an island to regain power. So that is the context in which he is operating. And so initially, I think it is worth noting that as a young man, Washington was quite ambitious. He wanted to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and he showed up at the Continental Congress in military uniform just to remind them that he had that experience. But by the end of the war, he understood And I should actually say, for the duration of the war, even though he wanted that power, he was very mindful never to try and abuse it because, again, the hearts and minds thing of the American people. Right. But also, he had to remain deferential to Congress or the entire experiment didn't count. Because if he became a military dictator, then he was no different than a king. It was just a military figure. So he understood that his deference to Congress, his willingness to submit and to return his commission was essential to the character of this, movement for independence. And that was really difficult because Congress was often very annoying and didn't know what they were doing, and they were inefficient, and they didn't give him what he needed, and he remained respectful and deferential, which is incredibly impressive because, anyone else would have, I think, lost it with them. So he returned his commission at the end of the war when I think he could have easily become a military dictator. And in fact, some people were asking him to. And he said, no, that is not what we're doing. Then as president, he did not want to be president. He understood that he was the only person that could do it. He was the only person that had the national profile, what we would think of as the name recognition, but also the trust in the American people that he could be trusted with this incredible authority, could be trusted with this incredible power, and was the only person that could bring the states together. So he did it sort of begrudgingly, knowing that it was essential. And so by the time he was ready to leave the presidency, he wanted to leave after the first term, and he was convinced by a number of aides and friends that he had to stay. He wanted to go home for personal reasons. He was tired of politics. He was tired of, criticism, which he did receive. He was ready to be home at Mount Vernon. But also he understood that if he stayed in office until he died, then it would set the precedent that presidents are essentially elected kings. Yeah. And, or I should say elected presidents, but elected presidents for life. And that was a dangerous precedent to establish. He also understood that that first transition, whenever it happened, was going to be incredibly scary for the American people because they only knew what it was to have him as president. And so he wanted to ensure it happened in orderly fashion, not suddenly when he died. He wanted to ensure that he was there to lend his legitimacy to the new administration and to kind of help smooth that process. And he understood that the American people had to be taught how to do this. This was not something they did on a national level. And again, when they looked around, they were not seeing it in the world. And so he wanted to help them do that. And that was an incredible thing to do. We just don't see it all that often in the scope of human history.
No, not at all. And that's, I think, why we appreciate who he was, and he was the best president, not only the first, but the best president, I think, that set the tone for America. We can't get out of here without mentioning, because we've talked about spies and, espionage, but can you name a few that we did not talk about? I know one, Benedict Arnold, but can you give us a couple that should get honorable mention of who do you think were some of the best spies for America and against America?
Well, so the Culper Ring is named after a man, Robert Townsend, who went by Samuel Culper.
Oh, the singer?
So he sort of ran that ring. So that's an important one. It's possible that his messages were sort of picked up by Caleb Brewster, who was another name that was in that ring. Those are names people should know. There are also a number of spies that, Nathan Hale is the one that is best known for saying, I wish that I had more than one life to give for my nation or something like that. He was a terrible spy. He was very earnest, but did all things wrong. And speaking of spies that did all things wrong, John Andre was Benedict Arnold's British handler, and he was probably a British officer and not just a spy master, but because he carried papers in his boots, Spycraft 101, do not carry your papers on you, explaining what your plans are. Right. When he was captured, he was hung as a spy because he wasn't in uniform. And so certainly he was helpful to the United States because it revealed Benedict Arnold's treason and the plot to hand over West Point, which would have been devastating to the American cause. But from the British perspective, he was a pretty failed spy.
All right. Well, fun question. I think this was something that I probably would answer myself, but I'll let you answer it. If you could sit in on one of these secret meetings from the Revolutionary era, Freemasons, the Culper Ring, Constitutional Congress, or Continental Congress, in the back room, where would you go and why?
Man, that's such a good question.
I know, yeah, because each one has its own.
There's so many questions I have that I wish we had better information on. I guess I would love to see, if Washington had like a spy book, which I don't think he actually kept that many materials because I think he saw it as dangerous, but I would love to know the spycraft. That would be really fun.
I love it. All right. Well, tell everybody about you wherever they can find you, and then how can they also contribute and help out with George Washington's presidential library?
Well, thank you so much. I can be found online on most social media channels. I'm the only one with my name, so it's easy. It's relatively easy to find me.
You are.
I do write a monthly newsletter, which is called Imperfect Union at imperfectunion.substack.com. And I send out a monthly essay sort of explaining the historical origins or how something has evolved, especially if it's important to our current moment, as well as links to all the podcasts and press and media I do, like this one, and other things that I have written. In terms of the presidential library, you can, of course, go to mountvernon.org/library, which is the library website. You can also find us on YouTube and social media. We are open to anyone who makes a research appointment. So it is by appointment only, but you don't have to be a professional historian. We do have open house days on Washington's birthday. And of course, Mount Vernon is open 365 days a year. So you're welcome to visit us whenever you are in the area, and we would love to see you.
Perfect. And just a P.S., do you think, how would Americans perceive George Washington if he was president today?
He would not do well in our current system. He was very reserved. He did not like to talk a whole lot in public. That was partly because he was a little bit self-conscious of his lack of formal education, but he also wore very uncomfortable dentures that were hard to speak in, and especially speak and eat. So he tended to be fairly quiet. He was not necessarily one for a lot of, public speaking. He certainly would not be a fan of social media. And so a lot of the things that we have come to expect of our presidents, he would not do well with those expectations. But I think that if we could set that part of it aside, he had excellent judgment. He had the ability to bring people around him that had a lot of different diverse viewpoints and gather information from them that he needed to make good decisions. And so certainly his decision making would be excellent.
Awesome. And PSS. I keep remembering these things because I have you here, but is it true? I saw it on a TV show. So is it true? Was he visited, or did he have visions of what America was going to look like?
Well, he had a vision for what he wanted it to look like. I don't know, I don't think most people can predict the future. Yeah. So he certainly believed that the United States would expand westward. He believed westward expansion was an important part of actually bringing the existing parts of the nation together. He believed in the American experiment and its ability to survive long term. I think that he believed in the importance of the United States engaging on the world stage, and what that looked like would, of course, evolve over time. But he was not an isolationist, and so he believed that the United States could grow to become, the word superpower was not one that they used in the 18th century, but he believed that the nation could grow to become a power broker on the world stage. And yet he also saw the divisions that would potentially, throw a wrench in the works. So he warned in his farewell address against allowing partisan alliances or partisan identity to overtake your American identity. He warned against foreign interference, and he warned against permanent alliances, which is often misinterpreted to mean, not having alliances. What he was saying is we can't allow ourselves to be dragged into wars that have nothing to do with our self-interest. And so in his case, he was thinking about an alliance with France, alliance that had been signed in 1778. And so he would warn against that. So those are all things that we have grappled with over the many centuries. And I think he was quite wise to warn us against those, recognizing that they were central aspects of what it meant to be an American, and they were going to emerge again and again.
Just listen to Papa. So, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Lindsay. I appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. This was fun.
And so everybody, please go support this wonderful guest, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Chervinsky. I knew it. I was going to miss.
It's like church, but
Chervin. What is that background?
It is, Eastern European, sort of Russian, Ukrainian.
Yeah, it sounds like my grandfather was Ruzhiksko, so it was Czech Republican. So anyway, all right, we're going to get out here because she wants to go eat and have a nice evening. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. And until then, adios.